Spring of 1948. A brownstone on Mulberry Street, Little Italy. The room was thick with cigar smoke and tension when Bumpy Johnson pushed through the door alone. No backup, no weapons visible, just a man in a perfectly tailored suit walking into a room filled with 15 Italian mobsters who'd been waiting to teach him a lesson about respect. Vito Genovese sat at the head of the table, flanked by his most trusted capos, soldiers positioned at every exit, and the message was clear. Bumpy had crossed a line. He'd refused to pay tribute for operating in a neighborhood the Italians considered theirs. And in the world of organized crime, that kind of disrespect usually ended with a body in the Hudson River. But what happened in the next hour wouldn't just shock everyone in that room. It would rewrite the rules of how black and Italian gangsters did business in New York City forever. Let's rewind 6 months. Late 1947, Harlem was Bumpy Johnson's kingdom. After serving time and building his reputation as the man who stood up to Dutch Schultz, Bumpy had become untouchable uptown. He controlled the numbers racket, the protection schemes, the gambling dens. Everything that made money in Harlem flowed through Bumpy Johnson. But Harlem's boundaries were bleeding into other territories. East Harlem, also known as Spanish Harlem, sat right on the edge of Italian territory. And as Bumpy's operations expanded, his runners started collecting bets, his enforcers started providing protection, and his influence started creeping into neighborhoods the Italian families had controlled for decades. Vito Genovese didn't like it. Genovese had recently returned from Italy where he'd been hiding from murder charges. He was hungry, ambitious, and rebuilding his power base within the Luciano crime family. He saw Bumpy's expansion not just as competition, but as a direct challenge to Italian dominance. Genovese sent word through intermediaries: stay in Harlem, pay tribute if you want to operate in our neighborhoods, respect the boundaries. Bumpy's response was silence. He didn't pay, he didn't pull back, he didn't acknowledge the warning. He just kept doing business. That's when the bodies started dropping. 3 of Bumpy's numbers runners were found beaten within an inch of their lives in East Harlem. A gambling spot Bumpy protected was firebombed at 2 in the morning. The message was escalating, and everyone in New York's underworld was watching to see what Bumpy would do. Would he back down? Would he go to war? Or would he do something nobody expected? Bumpy did something nobody expected. He walked into Genovese's headquarters alone and asked for a meeting. The request itself was stunning. You didn't just walk into a mob stronghold without an army unless you had a death wish or a plan so bold it bordered on insanity. Genovese's people thought it was a trap. They searched Bumpy 3 times before letting him into the building. They checked for wires, for weapons, for anything that might explain why a man would voluntarily walk into the lion's den. They found nothing. Just a man in an expensive suit with a leather briefcase and an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. The brownstone on Mulberry Street was Genovese's territory, his safe space, his seat of power. The room where they met was long and narrow, with a table running down the center. Vito Genovese sat at the far end, positioned so anyone entering would have to walk the full length of the room under the watch of every soldier present. 15 men in total, each one a made member of the Genovese family, each one responsible for multiple murders. Frank Lavorsi, the enforcer who'd ordered the attacks on Bumpy's operations, Tony Bender, Genovese's underboss and closest confidant, and at least 8 soldiers standing along the walls, hands in their pockets, eyes cold. Bumpy walked in at exactly 2 p.m. He didn't hurry, he didn't look nervous. He walked with the measured pace of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, even if nobody else in the room did. His shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, the only sound in the room besides breathing and the distant traffic outside. He reached the table, pulled out a chair directly across from Genovese, and sat down without being invited. He placed his briefcase flat on the table, folded his hands on top of it, and looked Genovese directly in the eyes. Vito spoke first. His voice was rough, heavy with a Neapolitan accent that decades in America hadn't smoothed out. "You got some nerve, Bumpy, walking in here after what you've been doing. You think because you're untouchable in Harlem, you're untouchable everywhere?" Bumpy didn't blink. "I'm here because I respect you enough to talk face to face. That's more respect than most men in your position ever get from me." The room shifted. Several soldiers moved forward, but Genovese raised one finger and they froze. "Respect." Genovese leaned forward. "You've been operating in my neighborhoods, taking my money, refusing to pay tribute, and you call that respect. Let me tell you what respect looks like. Respect looks like staying in your lane. Respect looks like acknowledging that this city has rules older than you. Respect looks like a black man knowing his place." That last sentence hung in the air like a loaded gun. Every person in that room understood what Genovese was really saying. This wasn't just about territory. This was about the racial hierarchy that had defined organized crime for generations. Italian mobsters at the top, everyone else underneath.
and Bumpy Johnson, a black man, was challenging that order simply by existing at the level he operated. Bumpy's expression didn't change. He reached for his briefcase, clicked it open, and pulled out a stack of papers. He spread them across the table, 5 documents in total, each one carefully organized and annotated. "These are ledgers," Bumpy said calmly. "Every number spot in East Harlem, every gambling den, every protection payment collected in the last 6 months." He tapped the first document. "This one shows your family is pulling in approximately $32,000 a month from East Harlem. Not bad." He slid a second document forward. "This one shows that 70% of that money comes from Black and Puerto Rican customers who cross into your territory because you don't have operators in their neighborhoods who speak their language or understand their community." Vito picked up the ledger, scanning the numbers. His face revealed nothing, but his capos were leaning in now, looking at the documents with increasing interest. Bumpy continued, "When my runners started operating in East Harlem, your revenue didn't go down, it went up. In the last 4 months, the total gambling revenue in East Harlem increased by 41%. You want to know why? Because my people brought in customers you couldn't reach. We made the game accessible to communities that didn't trust Italian operators. We expanded the market." He pulled out another document, this one with photographs attached. "These are your competition. Irish crews moving in from the Bronx, Jewish bookmakers setting up shop on the borders, Puerto Rican numbers runners who don't answer to anyone. While you're focused on pushing me out, they're quietly taking territory you don't even realize you're losing." Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "You can try to force me out. You've got the muscle. You've got the connections. But if you do that, you'll spend the next 5 years fighting a war in East Harlem while your real enemies take everything else." Tony Bender spoke up for the first time. "So what are you proposing? That we just let you operate wherever you want?" Bumpy shook his head. "I'm proposing a partnership. A real one. Not the kind where I pay tribute and get nothing in return. The kind where we both make more money than we're making now." He pointed to the ledgers. "I keep operating in East Harlem, but under a
revenue sharing agreement. 60% to me, 40% to you. In return, I expand the customer base, I handle all the street-level operations, and you provide protection from law enforcement and other families trying to move in." Frank Lavorsi slammed his hand on the table. 60-40? You think you're worth that much?" Bumpy turned to look at him, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I know I'm worth that much, because without me, you're making $32,000 a month and spending half of it on enforcement and payoffs. With me, you're making more than $50,000 a month with 0 overhead, 0 risk, and 0 exposure. Do the math." Genovese was silent, studying Bumpy with the intensity of a predator deciding whether its prey was worth the effort. Finally, he spoke. "And what makes you think I won't just take your operation, your connections, your customers, and cut you out completely once I have what I need?" Bumpy smiled for the first time since entering the room. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man holding cards nobody else could see. "Because I didn't come here unprepared." He reached into his briefcase one more time and pulled out a single envelope. He slid it across the table to Genovese. "Inside that envelope are the names and addresses of every dirty cop on your payroll in East Harlem, every judge you've bought, every politician who takes your money, every secret bank account you use to wash your earnings." He paused, letting that sink in. "I've got copies in 3 different locations. If anything happens to me, if I disappear, if I'm found dead in an alley, those documents go to the FBI, the district attorney, and the New York Times simultaneously. Your entire operation collapses in 72 hours." The room exploded. Soldiers reached for their guns. Frank Lavorsi jumped to his feet, shouting. Tony Bender moved toward Bumpy, murder in his eyes, but Genovese didn't move. He just sat there, staring at Bumpy with an expression that was impossible to read. Then, slowly, he started to laugh. Not a mocking laugh, not an angry laugh, a genuine laugh of appreciation. He raised his hand, and the room went silent. Everyone froze, guns half drawn, fury radiating from every corner, but nobody moved with Genovese's permission. He opened the envelope, glanced at the first page, and set it down. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the craziest. Maybe both." He stood up, walked around the table, and extended his hand to Bumpy. 60-40, revenue sharing. You operate in East Harlem under the Genovese family's protection, but you report to me personally. Any disputes, I settle them. Any problems with other families, I handle them. You stay in line, we both get rich. Bumpy stood, shook his hand. One firm grip that sealed a deal more powerful than any contract. "We have an understanding." Genovese held his hand for an extra second, his voice dropping to a whisper only Bumpy could hear. "If you ever threaten me again, there won't be enough pieces of you left to identify." Bumpy whispered back. "If you ever try to cheat me, you'll lose everything you've built before you even realize it's happening." They released hands. The tension in the room shifted from murderous to something else, a grudging respect mixed with the understanding that these two men, from completely different worlds, had just forged an alliance nobody saw coming. Frank Lavorsi was furious, pacing the room and muttering in Italian. Tony Bender looked skeptical but intrigued.
The soldiers along the wall slowly lowered their weapons, exchanging glances that said they'd just witnessed something unprecedented. Genovese poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter on the side table. He handed one to Bumpy. To business. Bumpy raised his glass, to staying alive long enough to enjoy it. They drank, and with that toast, the meeting was over. The deal held for 6 years. Bumpy operated in East Harlem with Genovese family protection. Revenue exploded exactly as Bumpy had predicted, climbing from $32,000 a month to over $80,000 within the first year. Genovese's share alone was more than he'd been making from the entire territory before. When other families tried to move in, Genovese shut them down with the kind of brutal efficiency that reminded everyone why he was one of the most feared men in organized crime. And Bumpy, for his part, never missed a payment, never overstepped his boundaries, and never gave Genovese a reason to regret the deal. Years later, after Bumpy had died, and Genovese was serving time in federal prison, a reporter asked Genovese about the rumors of his partnership with Bumpy Johnson. Genovese, who rarely spoke to the press, made an exception. He said Bumpy Johnson was the only man who ever walked into my headquarters and walked out with a better deal than I wanted to give him. He didn't beg, he didn't threaten with violence, he threatened with intelligence, and that's something you can't fight with guns. The meeting on Mulberry Street became legendary, not because of bloodshed, but because of what it represented. A black gangster walking into an Italian mob stronghold alone, and emerging not just alive, but victorious. It proved that in the world of organized crime, respect wasn't given based on race or tradition. It was earned through intelligence, courage, and the ability to see the game 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Bumpy Johnson understood something that day that most gangsters never figure out. Real power isn't about who's got the biggest crew or the most guns. It's about who's got the leverage, the information, and the guts to sit across from their enemy and make them realize that cooperation is more profitable than war. That's the lesson Bumpy taught in that brownstone on Mulberry Street, and it's a lesson that echoes through the history of organized crime to this day. If this story of courage, strategy, and the meeting that changed everything inspired you, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Share this with someone who needs to understand that sometimes walking in alone is the strongest move you can make. Drop a comment and let me know. Would you have the nerve to do what Bumpy did? Keep hustling, keep thinking 3 steps ahead, and I'll see you in the next one.